This day was instituted to honor and give thanks to the servicemen and women from every branch of service, from all wars ever fought, including those serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, and worldwide. The celebration today is especially dedicated to those that served in World War II. My name is Buelow. I was a lieutenant in the Army Air Force, serving from April 1943 until July 1946 as a navigator on a B-24 bomber. In 1940, the USA was still in the Great Depression, which started in 1929. Back then, an average man's wage was $1,000 to $1,400 a year. Unemployment was in the area of 15 to 18%. When you realize the women were a relatively small proportion of the workforce, you can understand how devastating this unemployment was. Most of the people were many of the people were extremely poor. In 1940, the USA was still in the Depression was bad enough, but in addition, almost the entire world lived under the dictatorship. Russia under Stalin, Germany under Hitler, Italy under Mussolini, and Japan under Tojo. The world was engaged in war all over Europe, Northern Africa, the Western Pacific, and Asia Minor. President Roosevelt's 1940 campaign for his third term as president blatantly pledged, "No American boys will die in Europe." That year, the Congress did pass the Lend-Lease Act for supplying arms to Britain, and therefore the economy started to pick up. The U.S. did furnish the arms for the entire Allied cost of the war to be paid back after the war. Of course, that didn't happen because they were broke. Our family was as poor as most, so we didn't own a radio until 1937. And we used it every night to hear the news, just as you do cable now. Every night, throughout the years, the airwaves were full of war, war, war. Plenty of scary stuff for a young kid. The government instituted the draft in 1940 as a precaution for what lay ahead of us. Up until then, our military budget was minuscule. We had fewer men under arms than Portugal, a small country. Fast forward to 6 a.m. Hawaii time, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese Navy. Almost the entire American fleet was in Honolulu at the time, and 7 battleships were sunk or severely damaged. Fortunately, no American aircraft carriers were in the port that day. I was attending the movies at the time of the announcement of the attack and went to deliver the extra newspapers that were being printed. I was almost 17 years old and a senior at Rufus King High School when the attack occurred. I graduated from high school in June of 1942, and along with all the males, I expected to be entered the draft on my 18th birthday. But in July, while I was still 17 years old, I volunteered to be an Army Air Force cadet and was accepted, but not called up until April of 1943. After extensive navigation training, I was commissioned a second lieutenant in August of 1944 and assigned to Casper, Wyoming for combat training. In October 1944, on the day that we were supposed to go to Europe, the European theater war, I was hospitalized with acute appendicitis, and my crew left without me, and they were shot down. The attrition rate for the Air Force crews in Europe was almost 100% because each massive bombing raid was suffering losses of 10 to 15%. With 25 missions being the requirement before a crew could be relieved, it became almost a death sentence. Most of you remember the Memphis Belle crew, who were fortunate to return to America. Their 25 missions was practically a miracle, and they were idolized as heroes. And they spoke at my graduation class from navigation school. After recovery from my operation, I was reassigned to a new crew for combat training for the second time at Pueblo, Colorado. At the completion of this training, the Air Force decided that our crews weren't needed in the Atlantic as they were in the Pacific, so I was reassigned again to Walla Walla, Washington, to undergo training for the third time. This has become an old hat. On completion, we were given a choice of going into combat or further training on new larger bombers similar to the B-29. We agreed almost to the man to go to combat. I'd like to give you a short version of my service in the Pacific Theater. The gigantic Pacific covers 1/3 of the world's surface. Navigation skills were especially valuable since the sea would be as much of an enemy as the enemy itself. On July 14, 1945, my crew departed from Matherfield, California, Sacramento, California, for Hawaii. It is funny, up until that time, the crew didn't have too much wherewithal with the navigator. Who's that guy? But when they realized they'd be flying over water, they'd be in the hands of a young kid, guided only by the stars, they suddenly became aware of the position's importance. The flight was about 1,600 miles, was close to the maximum range of a B-24 bomber. And after a few hours rest, after we got there, after a few hours rest, we did get to see Waikiki Beach and left right away for the next island. We left Honolulu for Canton Island with an all-day flight. And the following day, we continued on to Tarawa in the Central Pacific. The defenses of Tarawa were the most formidable of all the Pacific islands at that time. And the Japanese general of that fortress had stated that 1,000,000 men, taking 1,000 years, could never take the place. Concrete pillboxes surrounded the island. Thank you, Marines, Army, and Navy, for the many bloody fights at the cost of thousands of lives. Taking remote islands to provide landing fields required for the air crews and supplies to reach the battle area in the Pacific. I was not destined to be a hero, but my brother-in-law, Ed Brown, now 94 years young, who cycles 15 miles a day, he and his group and men like him, they were the heroes. Ed was a young Marine in the invasion of Tarawa in November of 1943, and later wounded in Saipan in June of 1944. Saipan became the base used by B-29 planes to attack Japan. Tarawa was taken at a cost of 978 dead, 2,188 wounded. The Japanese losses were 4,500. It was the first Marine landing, and many lessons were learned. It would be necessary to improve the landing craft which had hung up on the reefs due to a lower than tide that they had predicted. And this caused the Marines to have to jump out of the boats and walk through water endlessly. Some of them drowned, they lost their weapons, and they were being fired upon by the enemy. From Tarawa, we next flew to Biak, a very large island off the northwest coast of New Guinea. Taken by MacArthur's Army forces in early May 1944, it was a total jungle. Still had headhunters, believe it or not. And was taken at a great cost, a portion of which by the Army, MacArthur's forces. We were required to leave our plane there because it had been turned, an area had been cleared, and they were storing all these new planes, and we were given the old planes. We were required to leave. Oh, just a note of interest, talking about chow. What was the chow like? Well, on the 3 islands that we were on, they were feeding us mainly Spam. And it really tasted pretty good. And we said, hey, this isn't bad. And then we said that to the regulars, and they said, yeah, but how would you feel about it if you had it every day for two years? Our crew was then provided transport. We no longer had our plane to Biak, a very large island off the coast of New Guinea. Our crew was then provided transport from Biak to the naval base on Buelow Island. The Marine general who was assigned to taking Buelow in November of 1944 had predicted it would take 4 days. However, the Japanese had changed their tactics. They now went to tunnels underneath the ground and interlocking tunnels. And 2 months later, at a cost of 6,500 lives, before they had that island. Each battle resulting in increased casualties. Just another note about the chow. That chow was terrific at Buelow, which led us to believe that the Navy was transported the goods and all its ships was getting more than its fair share of the goodies. But God bless the Navy. Next, it was Clark Field in Manila. The city of Manila was reduced entirely to rubble. Not one building left standing, leaving the population homeless and starving. Clark Field was the home of the 5th Army Air Force headquarters. Our orders made us members of the 43rd Bomb Squadron based on Aishima, the northernmost island of the Okinawa chain. Just before we left our post on May 6th, the atom bomb was dropped. Talk about shock and disbelief when we heard about the 20,000 kilotons and all that stuff, which sounded like fairy tales to us. Aishima had just been secured on April 24th, just a few months before we got there, and had 3 runways rebuilt just months before we arrived. Ernie Pyle, the great newspaper writer and the inventor of the term G.I. Joe, was killed during the taking of that island. Japan made overtures for peace, after which my crew was assigned a combat mission. It would turn out to be the last flight of the war. And with the caveat that bombs not be dropped unless we were fired upon. The Japanese were starting to wave. Again, I was not with them. I had been hospitalized with amoebic dysentery. Contacted the day we arrived, and my weight dropped from 140 to 80 pounds. This is the same disease that killed all our veterans on the Bataan death march. Wasn't cured without sulfur penicillin. Thank God they were invented. The Japanese surrender was imminent, and during the treaty negotiations, Japanese planes painted white with green crosses carrying the Japanese diplomats to the Philippine Islands landed on Aishima. My illness prevented me from closely observing this bit of history. On August 16th, the peace treaty was signed on board ship in Tokyo Harbor. While awaiting orders to Japan for the Army of Occupation, Aishima went through 2 Category 5 typhoons. They completely destroyed all the facilities on the island, including the mess hall. Gone. We saw the shower room, which was nothing more than a platform surrounded by sheet metal, went sailing through the air like a kite. An emergency was declared, and we survived these vicious storms. Days later, we were transferred to Japan in the Army of Occupation, where I remained until July of 1946. The most unusual assignment during my tour in Japan was being the navigator of the crew that was to fly the American scientific team into Hiroshima from Tokyo. We were housed in a railroad car, which was specifically on the spot where the bomb had hit. 500 feet above us, over our heads, is where it had exploded. While there, I picked up a beer bottle out of a trench that it was laying in. It was melted. It takes 2,000 degrees to melt it. When I saw this destruction, even after seeing the damage in Manila, Osaka, Tokyo, and all the Japanese cities, which were leveled, it was overwhelming. Nothing remained higher than 3 feet, burned brown. Only one building, a tower about 2 stories in height, totally gutted, remained. Its columns were sticking out the top, bent over from the heat. I thought the end of the world was here, because we were starting to get the Russians in our PXs, and they were acting real ornery, and we thought we were going to be fighting Russia. And I prayed that I'd get home one more time. I did sail for home in July of 1946, and typical of my whole career, we didn't make it. The ship got stalled. The bearings went out 100 miles from Seattle. They had to come out and tow us into port. It took us a couple days. We waited to be towed in port. That was funny. And more than one of us kissed the ground of the good old USA and praised God upon departure. So that's my story. I'm only here by the grace of God, who directed every move in bringing me home, along with Ed Brown and many others. We give thanks to God for his mercy, and ask the Lord to bless America and its military.